So I'm a principal architect with the Azure data team, and people have seen that and said, Bob, I thought you're a SQL guy. I am. Turns out the organization at Microsoft that owns all of the SQL assets is called Azure Data under Rohan Kumar, and I work under that organization. And people have also said to me, especially lately, haven't seen me in a while, is what do you work on these days? I said, well, if it's got the word SQL in it, I work on it, which is either SQL Server, Azure SQL, Azure Arc SQL, Azure SQL Ledger. If it's got the word SQL, I spend time on those technologies because I really love the technology. But today, we'd love to get an opportunity to take a focus for you on our latest release of SQL Server that we announced last fall called SQL Server 2022. Now, you're probably gonna, as Timothy just talked about, you're like, I want to get this deck as soon as Bob is done. Here's the good news for you. Everything I'm talking about today is all public information. And in fact, this link that you see here on the top of this slide, AKMS SQL Server 2022 Dex, is a PDF version of what I'm showing you today. And even there, it's a OneDrive. There's other PDF files for deeper dives on the topics that we're talking about. In addition, at the very end, the last slide I have is more resources, and we'll talk about those more resources, which includes some really nice demonstrations through video format that you can watch, or just gathering other details of what's going on in this release. I do have some demos that I'm going to do throughout. They're recorded because it's a very consistent way to show you things, especially me being connected to the cloud. But it'll be kind of fun to kind of see an actual demonstration in some cases of what I'm talking about. Here's my goal for today. I want you to get a good feel, because it's an introduction session, right? What is this thing? What is SQL Server 2022? And what's in it? What are the major capabilities? Why would I even want to think about it? Like maybe today you're thinking about running Azure SQL or staying on a version of SQL Server I know and love today. Why would I even want to consider upgrading to this? And then how does it work? Like how does it even solve some challenges and common things that you may see today in your environment? So with those goals in mind, let me kind of start going into why I think SQL Server 2022 could be compelling for you. And ironically, the way to start that conversation is to kind of step back for a second and talk about the previous releases of SQL Server. And you're like, hey, wait a minute, I thought this was a SQL 2022 talk. Why are you reviewing things for me I may already know about? Here's why. Here's the story. I spent between the fall of 2018 and the winter of 2019 traveling across the world. I know there was a time and day when people did things like that. And I did. I had some like 50,000 miles I've spent. I did a lot of things virtually too, talking about SQL 19. And here's what I found. I found a lot of customers didn't know some of the major functionalities in 19 that were in 16 and 17. Now, it's not their fault, it's my fault. And so in here, you can see some of these major capabilities: query store, polybase, SQL on Linux, containers, adaptive query processing. And it's important for you to know that in SQL 2022, these major things you see on your screen right here are part of 2022. Because you may be on a release in your organization or working with a customer that's not even on SQL 16, and you're wondering, should I go to the latest version of SQL Server? So I didn't want to make that same mistake. And so the other thing that's interesting is some of the things we're doing in SQL 2022 are based on this. They're enhancements to these functionalities, or we're taking something we've done and enhancing something else using a foundation of what we've already done. And you'll see that today in this presentation. Okay, so if I had to give you the why, in a slide, a single slide, like why is SQL Server 2022 compelling, it would be something like this. Number one, we are going to start connecting SQL Server in a hybrid way to connect to Azure in something we've never even tried before. And one of the things we're going to do is connect it for disaster recovery purposes. Secondly, we're going to connect SQL Server now for analytic reasons. We're going to take SQL Server data and connect this to Synapse in new and interesting ways. Third, we're going to take this new service you may have heard about last fall called Purview, and we're going to connect SQL Server to it for centralized insights and governance for security reasons. And then fourth, we want to make sure that you still know we take it very seriously that SQL Server is the least vulnerable database in the industry for the last decade. And that's not us saying that, that's a NIST organization saying that. But it just doesn't stay with that. What else are we doing? Well, we're going to provide you new capabilities to protect data integrity in something called Sql Ledger, which I think you'll enjoy hearing more about that. And then one of the bread and butter things that we do besides security is performance and availability. So you're going to make sure that you know and have trust that we're going to continue to invest in these areas in the SQL engine, which is really cool because it applies across everything. And not only will we eventually, by the time we release the product, have benchmark results, but we'll invest into things that are practically going to help you, make you faster and more available with query intelligence and multi-write replication. Now, keep this in mind as you're listening today, what I'm going to talk about. And this is important to me because, again, I told you I work on everything called SQL. And that is what you're talking about today is investments in the core engine, investments in T-SQL and in tools that apply to everything called SQL, whether it's the edge, running things on Arc, or even in the cloud itself. Because people will ask me, well, Bob, that's pretty cool about built-in query intelligence, but I'm going to migrate to the cloud. Do I get that? And the answer is going to be a big fat yes. Okay, with that in mind, when I presented last year SQL 2022 at the Ignite conference in the past summit, I presented this as a launch of a private preview, and I immediately out of the gate got hit with a bunch of questions. Totally get it. So let's go over some of those. First and foremost, we launched it as a private preview, which means it's not publicly available to anyone to download because we needed out of the gate to get a really direct connection with our customers and feedback about these features that we're talking about. And so today, if you want to do that, we're still in this private preview mode. You can use the link I show on my screen right here, which I'll also have at the final slide of the presentation, to sign up to work with directly folks on the engineering team to test some of these features and give us feedback. We have a Teams channel, a GitHub repo, all available for customers that are in this program. And you may be saying like, well, that's really not for me, but I want to know, when is this thing going to get released? And tongue in cheek, I'll say the same answer I said in 2019. At Microsoft, when we create a product with a name and a number on it, namely a year, we have to meet that or we lose our jobs. So we will launch this thing in this calendar year, but we have not announced yet when public preview will be there and when we will become generally available. I will give you a tip, and I said this thing before in previous years, a tip. We love to announce things at big events, and we still have big events, whether they're virtual or in person. So just think about big events that are Microsoft sponsored, and probably you'll have some announcements along the way on what we're doing with 2022, but we will launch this calendar year for sure. So in SQL 19, when I talked a lot about that product, I had a similar introduction 19 deck, and I had the major capabilities of what's in the product in something called a quadrant, like this quadrant looking thing on a slide. And so I also called that my camera slide. My camera slide, what does that mean? Well, it means that as I presented this around the world, people would love to take photos of it because it represented a good overview of the major things that we're doing in the release itself. This time, I've created what I call the wheel of power. So SQL 2022 being the hub and the spokes being the major categories. And if I didn't mention earlier, please start formulating your questions in the chat window, because as I go through some of the demonstrations, I'll use those as natural breaking points to answer your questions, but also we'll have time to answer questions at the end. So first and foremost, as I kind of hinted already, what's in this release? We're going to allow you to connect SQL Server to the cloud in Azure in ways we've never even dreamed before. SQL will now become a very hybrid platform. But the beauty of this is that you will connect on your terms. This isn't a requirement you be connected. This is only connecting in ways and scenarios that make sense to you. And we'll talk specifically about each of these three areas here shortly. Second, I also hinted at the fact that performance is important to our customers, and it's important to prove to people that we have a proven engine. And so not only will we be fast, but we'll be smart fast. So we're going to provide you built-in query intelligent functionality, and especially think in your head about getting faster or staying with consistent performance with no code changes. Third, if we don't invest in the core engine, we don't have a product. So we will always have a series of features for security, scalability, and availability. We'll touch on what that looks like a little bit, and we'll specifically dive into one area called Sql Ledger. Third, we want to enhance the data virtualization capabilities we did with Polybase in previous releases to get you access to data without moving the data into formats, into locations and storage facilities that you may be using in your environment that aren't SQL Server. So we'll certainly talk about that some. And then finally, we want to make sure you have confidence that your skills in T-SQL are valuable, and that we want to give you access to new features using the T-SQL language versus learning new languages. You can see here on our wheel of power that some of the spokes have dashed lines. Those are areas where you would be connecting your SQL to something outside your normal SQL Server environment. And so the other areas that are solid are areas we're investing inside the engine itself. So with this wheel of power in mind, excuse me? Okay, so if you guys don't mind, can you mute yourself if until we get to the question and answer parts? I'd really appreciate that. Thank you. So if you see here in the wheel of power, we have these 5 areas. Let's take time to drill into each of these, sometimes a little deeper. And I have some demonstrations I think you'll like to see as well. Okay, so connecting to the cloud in new exciting ways. What the heck am I talking about? Like, what I'd like to do as I present some of these is talk to you about a challenge that we think customers face and how we believe what we're doing provides a solution to that challenge. So I think, and I see, and you may believe the same way, that it's difficult to set up and maintain a DR site today. And not only that, sometimes when it gets set up, somebody leaves the company and doesn't leave all the knowledge behind of how they set it up. So it's really hard to maintain that. So what we think we would like to do to maintain and meet that challenge is built into SQL Server in a very seamless way, allow you to link your SQL Server 2022 instance with a managed instance, managed in the cloud, platform as a service. And that becomes your disaster recovery site. What we're going to do, we're going to use the built-in functionality of distributed availability groups, which is built into the engine itself, to communicate across between your SQL Server and managed instance and make this a very seamless process. So even if you don't even have an availability group on your SQL Server, we'll build one for you behind the scenes and make this connection work and start sending changes automatically to managed instance. And so when SQL Server has a problem and you need to actually have a disaster recovery scenario occur, you would fail over to your managed instance. That would now become your primary. And here's the beauty of this. Once we release the product, you will be able to fail back to your primary SQL Server when you're ready to bring that back online. So you now have a bidirectional failover partner for disaster recovery between SQL Server and managed instance. Now, we allow this today with Azure Virtual Machine, and some customers have built that, but they're the ones required to configure and set a lot up. Sure, the virtual machine is managed by Microsoft, but now you have a complete platform as a service that is managed by Microsoft for you. That becomes your DR site. In fact, you may think of it almost as way like a hands-free DR site, kind of like set it up, deploy it, get it configured, and not worry about it until you actually really need it. So I'm kind of really excited to see how this lands. It does bring a point where I need to mention one thing really important for you, because you probably have this question in your head. How are we going to license all this stuff? What is the pricing models going to look like? What about additions and features that exist in those? All of those will become known to you when we go generally available for SQL Server. We will use the preview period to make those decisions, but we'll look at new and innovative ways to make sure when you're connecting these resources that it's cost efficient for you to actually do those things. So all of those details will become available when we actually go generally available. Okay, so that's disaster recovery using managed instance, connecting to SQL in a hybrid way that's very, very powerful. Another challenge we've seen is customers that want to take their operational data with SQL Server, link that to Synapse in an analytics solution, but the challenge is this: writing ETL jobs, SSIS jobs, using factory, all those things are great technologies, but it's expensive to maintain them and write them. And if the data can become out of date very quickly, like maybe you only sync this stuff on a daily basis. And even it might affect your actual operational workload on SQL Server. So to meet that challenge, we have a solution called Synapse Link for SQL Server. And the concept is this: in a very seamless way, you'll be able to set up through Synapse and SQL a connection between these technologies. SQL Server will be connected now to Synapse SQL pools, the dedicated pools you have in Synapse today, which behave and act a lot like a SQL. And so when you set up this connection and seed and choose the data you want to synchronize with Synapse, now SQL Server will monitor changes to those tables that you tell us and automatically feed them into Synapse in a near real-time fashion. When I mean near real-time, I mean very quickly. So now, instead of waiting like a day for data to get updated for your analytics, for your Power BI reports, for your machine learning models, for Spark jobs, or combining with IoT data, you now have a very near real-time feed of SQL Server data in Synapse. I'm so pretty excited to see this technology, and we believe a lot of customers are going to find it very exciting. Just to let you know behind the scenes, because you may have this question, what are we using on SQL Server to make this work? Is this change data capture? Is this replication? Actually, it's different. It's a new technology that will still look at the transaction log, but it will be feeding data from the transaction log into Azure storage as an interim storage facility in a format that Synapse understands. In fact, what I think it'd be fun to do here is to take a look at a demonstration of what does this actually feel like. So this is a demo I recorded on an environment that I have where I've got a SQL Server 2022 locally on my machine connected to a wide world importer sample database. So I restored wide world importers, but here's what I did. I actually enhanced it. I actually added 2 new tables to wide world importers to track vehicle cargo data. So I've got a vehicle table with cities where the vehicles are located, and I've got a vehicle stock items to list which stock items are those vehicles carrying around. And I pre-populated with these vehicles a single stock item ID. So each of them only have like one piece of stock item to start with. Now, I go into Synapse and Synapse Studio now. You may not have seen this interface before. And I created what's called a dedicated SQL pool. This is like what you're used to use in the standard data warehouse scenario. And what's going to happen when I connect this together, I'm going to be able to take Synapse and use something called a link service. This is where I tie in the connectivity of where's my SQL Server, where's my Synapse pool, and establish something called an integration point, where what's something called the self-hosted integration runtime will run on my SQL Server and allow me to talk to Synapse. So the self-integration runtime can actually tell it what to do. Now here, after I've created my link service, is my connection between them. Here's where I pick the tables in SQL Server and tell it, because Synapse can recognize that now. Oh, here are the tables you have in your SQL Server. Which ones would you like to synchronize? I synchronize all of them. Here's my SQL Server. Here's the link. Here's the dedicated pool. And then whatever you see on the right over here is something else I've established called a landing zone. A landing zone is the Azure storage point for Azure Blob Storage, where we take the SQL Server changes and we put them in a file format, Parquet and CSV files, that Synapse understands. So once I have this link established and I start it, what happens is that Synapse will tell SQL Server, hey, start sending me this data through this seamless process. So I initially synchronize my data for all my tables. And then again, anytime I start making changes, data is seamlessly captured from the transaction log and fed into Synapse itself. So initially, I need to seed it, right? So I take copies of my data. This is all happening behind the scenes. You don't have to touch this, and this all happens for you automatically. You can see here, since I synchronized right here on the left, here are all the tables that I get from my SQL Server into my Synapse pools. And in fact, I built a query, because it's like SQL, right? Running against Synapse, to see what are the counts of cargo per city. Now, I'm sorry, man, I'm biased. I'm from Texas, so this demonstration has a bunch of cities in Texas. And you can see here that each vehicle is in a different city in Texas and has a cargo count of 1. So wouldn't it be nice if I could go back to SQL Server and make some random choices here on how many cargo items exist across vehicles, across various cities, run this query against my local SQL Server, but then go back to Synapse and quickly see the results of that change with the same query. So within seconds, I can run this query again, and I can see now I've got a bunch of different cargo sizes, and I'm actually just using the built-in charting capabilities of Synapse to see what that looks like. So you kind of see the process. I set up this synchronization, data got seeded into Synapse. Now I can just go in SQL and do my normal operational workload things that I want to do. And all of a sudden now that data automatically shows up in my SQL pools. Imagine the possibilities. If you have analysts or data scientists, they can run Power BI reports here. They can keep those reports up to date automatically. They can build machine learning models. They can combine this data maybe with IoT data. What if your vehicles had, like, for example, temperature information that you wanted to combine what's going on to do prediction of like maintenance and so forth? So this is Synapse Link, a short view of this as well. I've got other demos in resources at the end of the deck for you to go take a look at. I'm actually in the process right now, and a quick little hint to you. Timothy mentioned SQL Bits and the Azure SQL Conference. I'll be attending both of those in person, and we'll be showing off a lot more demonstrations of these technologies at those events. Okay, let me look at the chat window to see and go back up here and see what kind of questions we've had so far. Is this about SQL or does this include Azure SQL? So this is George asking this question. This talk is specifically about SQL Server 2022, George. I do have some resources I can share with you guys about Azure SQL that I've built. A lot of them during the pandemic, people have found very helpful. But I think you can see already that we're talking about hybrid features with SQL Server and Azure SQL. One of is managed instance, as one in Synapse Link. And I'm fixing to talk about the third piece of that, which is in security. Let's see here. Is there a bare metal solution? So George, I think you probably meant about managed instance disaster recovery. SQL Server itself, SQL Server, can be running in bare metal or in a virtual machine or using Azure VM, but the solution that we're specifically building is to make DR run in the cloud with a managed instance with Azure SQL Managed Instance. Yeah, so it is my understanding that you have to use a managed instance to set up a link server to talk between databases. Does that change at 2022? I'm not sure, Jason, what you mean by that. So when you mean about link servers between managed instances, that already exists today. You can do that already in Azure SQL Managed Instance. The link feature that we talked about here in this demonstration was for disaster recovery reasons. There is, by the way, though, I should tell you that the managed instance team has another variation of the link feature where they're going to support previous versions of SQL Server to link it to managed instance for migration purposes. And you can go read on their blog where they talk about that. When will a SQL 2022 be available via AWS RDS? You know, John, that's a better question for Amazon than me. You know, Amazon does work with us as a company to take versions when they're released and make them available in their services, but I don't have dates for when they would do that. We haven't even announced our general availability. So that would be a question more for the folks from Amazon than for me. Okay, so with that in mind, let me keep going further a little bit and now talk about the third part of the cloud connectivity story, and that is security. So we're going to do three things in this space. We've announced this. One is we're going to allow you to do Azure Active Directory Authentication now for SQL Server. We've done that already for Azure SQL Database and Managed Instance, and now we're going to allow SQL Server to have that. That also could be important for somebody to use in Azure Virtual Machine. So now you can do non-SQL authentication in the cloud without having a domain controller. That could be a really nice scenario, and that's what some customers have told us they're going to use this for. We'll talk about the capabilities of Purview in a second. And then Microsoft Defender for SQL is an interesting technology if you've not seen it before. So Microsoft Defender for SQL, part of the Defender for Cloud suite of services, gives you vulnerability assessments and security threat detection alerts against any SQL asset. And for SQL Server 2022, we will continue that trend and allow that to work for SQL Server. And it's pretty good technology. And the reason I like it is because it's very consistent, but it adapts to the SQL Server you're running on. So it works against Azure SQL VM, SQL Server now on premises, Azure SQL Database and Managed Instance. And the rules that it runs against are specific to that service. Like if there are best practices or vulnerability assessments that Azure Database doesn't make sense to run, it doesn't even run those. So a lot of times you'll see a SQL Server have a lot more findings run against it because it's a much more open system than our platform as a service. Let's talk about Purview though. So what's the challenge here and what are we trying to solve? So what our customers have told us is that they have a lot of SQL assets, both in the cloud now and on premises, and they need central insights and especially governance across all of this. So let's pick on a story here of what are the things we're doing in this is called policy management. And I'm in the process now of building some demonstrations of this. I don't have one to show you today, but I am working on how to show this off. So here's the challenge, or here's the way we're going to solve a challenge. The challenge is, I'm going to pick on Timothy for a second here on the phone. Let's say in my organization, I want to hire Timothy to be a performance monitor expert for my company.
Yeah.
I don't, hello?
I just said, yay, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. So Timothy's going to be my performance expert, but he's not going to be a sysadmin. I don't want to give him all those kind of rights, but here's the other challenge. I want Timothy to do this against like 10 SQL servers, both in the cloud and on premises. I do not want to go into each of these and add him as a login and add all these roles and add all these permissions. I'd rather go one place and publish a policy that says Timothy is now a performance monitoring person for these SQL servers. And I can just go to one spot and do it, and Purview will now publish and push down this policy. It understands SQL, so it can run the necessary commands to give him authorization to do this, and only that. Super powerful. And setting it up is one thing. What about maintaining? What if Timothy leaves the company? Now I can go to my policy and just say, well, get rid of Timothy from this policy. And that's automatically pushed to a bunch of SQLs. This is going to work against Azure SQL Database, Managed Instance, SQL and VM, SQL Server. Again, a central way to get insights and to do governance across all my SQL assets. So that is, in a nutshell, the big things we're doing here to make SQL Server a hybrid, true hybrid data platform in very new and exciting ways. Okay, the second part of the wheel of power was built-in query intelligence. And here's the challenge, and you know this challenge. Query tuning is expensive and time-consuming and sometimes requires a lot of extra money to hire experts or training. I'm not even sure this will ever go away for SQL Server, given how open T-SQL is, but we keep adding in functionality built into the engine to make this a better story. And here's what we're doing in SQL 22. We're going to take Query Store as a technology, we have built-in performance statistics with it, and we're going to turn it on by default for new databases. In addition, common customer request. We're going to allow you now to get Query Store performance statistics on read replicas from availability groups. Yay, that's a big common request we've had for several years. In addition, we're going to use Query Store and allow you to do hints with Query Store to persist hints to shape query plans without changing the application. Think of this as a much better way to do things like that are used to be called plan guides. Now, the other thing we're doing is we're investing further in intelligent query processing. That's a term that we've been using for the last few releases of SQL and in Azure SQL. And the concept is get faster by without changing your code based on common performance scenarios that we can recognize. And I call it the next gen of IQP, because it is the next generation of some scenarios that we're doing. In addition, here's what's interesting. We're going to tie this into the Query Store now as a feedback mechanism. So here are three examples of what those look like. On the left, one is degree of parallelism. On the second is cardinal estimation. These are common scenarios customers run in today. And we're going to use the Query Store to store information as a feedback mechanism. So as customer queries run, we will look at the feedback mechanism and we'll make decisions and changes to help smooth out and improve your workload. In addition, we are going to try to go solve a very common problem called parameter sensitive plan optimization. But that's not it. Let's talk about, there's some other things we're doing here. And let's kind of talk about the entire landscape of what we call IQP and how it affects when you upgrade, not upgrade. Okay, so first of all, know it's a cloud-first technology. We love to take this technology in the query processor and invest in the cloud first and then push it into SQL Server. This is an interesting scenario right now, though, because we're talking about things in SQL Server 2022 in private preview that really haven't even gone public preview in the cloud yet. So I think in some cases, you're going to see these things kind of align and get announced at a similar time frame. So let's say you make a decision to upgrade to SQL Server 2022. What do you get? Well, first of all, you may be familiar with database compatibility levels. And database compat 140 and 150 represent the compat levels that were default for SQL 17 and SQL 19. I call those IQP Gen 1 and Gen 2. So if you upgrade to 2022 and you have these compat levels, you already inherit functionality that we had from previous releases. But even if you just stay at these levels or don't even use those levels, you get the following. You get approximate versions of our percentile functions, really important for data warehousing workloads, where we're going to go after make queries that use percentiles much faster without having to scan the entire table. We did this for distinct in a previous release. Now we're just going to up the game and do it for other functions. In addition, if the Query Store is turned on, which will be by default in SQL 2022, we will light up two new functionalities, one called Query Compilation Replay and Degree of Parallelism Feedback. The degree of parallelism feedback, or DOP feedback, is a way to try to smooth out your workloads if a DOP query runs that is causing harm to all the workloads, right? And we'll use query hints as a way to do that and persist that into the Query Store. Query Compilation Replay is very interesting because this is us. Excuse me, if you don't mind, could you guys make sure you're muted if you don't mind, in case so we can make sure everybody can hear the presentation. I appreciate that. So Query Compilation Replay, if you think about it today, when you run a SQL Server, and if you have a planned cache eviction moment, like everything gets evicted from cache, and everybody tries to come up from the app and run, everything gets compiled at once. We call that a compile storm. So we have a way now built into SQL Server to persist what we call compile steps. And if we come in and start running these queries at the very beginning, and determine they don't have to get recompiled. It's a way for us to kind of save pieces of the compilation process so it's much faster, and it's a huge, huge help for CPU. In fact, so we've seen some customers run into these problems. It's really a great example of us taking feedback from real customer workloads and solving those automatically with SQL Server. Okay, if you happen to be on a DB compat level of 140 or greater in SQL 2022, in addition to what you get on the left, in the middle here, we're going to enhance the memory grant feedback process we set up in SQL Server 2019 and 17. We're going to use a new percentile functionality, and we're actually going to be able to persist the decisions we made and put that into the query store itself. So we're just kind of enhancing something we did in the past. Now, let's say you move to SQL 2022 and you're ready to go to the latest compat level, which is now 160. What do you get? You get something called parameter sensitive plan optimization. Can we save the world finally from parameter sniffing? I will show you in a second that we indeed can. And cardinality estimation has been a huge thorn in a lot of customers' side once they've moved to the latest versions of SQL Server, forcing them to put in all these different options and configurations to avoid it. Now we just want to solve that by default and use the query store as a mechanism to get feedback from your queries and decide, can we use query hints to adjust and make them faster? What a lineup of stuff that we've put into, and this is all built into the engine. This is not an add-on. This just comes with SQL Server. In some scenarios, you have to light up something to get it, like a DB compat level. And the other thing that you should know here before we move on and talk about parameter sniffing is you have the ability through database configuration options and even at the query level to turn off pieces of this. So for example, you may go to DB compat 160, but you don't want memory grant feedback for your database. No problem. You have a way of going into the database, configuring and say, I don't want that functionality. I don't want all this stuff. I only want certain pieces of it. You have control over all of that. So let's take an example of parameter sniffing or parameter sensitive plans and see what I'm talking about, including even a demonstration. All right, so we tell developers all the time, and if you're a DBA, you always do this, write stored procedures, parameterize your queries. There's a problem that can happen when you do that, and that is the following. Let's say a developer built an app and wrote a stored procedure that in the stored procedure queries a table with a simple where clause. It's a very, very common pattern, right? And that where clause uses a parameter from the stored procedure to make that where clause decision. Well, let's say in the case of using parameter value of 1 in my example, that results in something called an index seek, which is a very efficient way to go after a small number of rows. It's very, very fast for this user. User's all happy, the developer's happy, the app's happy. Let's say for reasons out of the control of the developer and the customer and everyone, that plan gets evicted from cache. Doesn't even know it's happened. Well, it's no problem because if the procedure runs again, we can simply recompile and put a new plan in cache. Well, it turns out that if the timing of things work in a certain way, and the other user comes in and runs that same stored procedure from the app, but for whatever reason, the parameter is a 10 fed in from the app somehow, let's say that under the covers, based on statistics, that 10 results in a query that needs to scan the index. That's the fastest way to get the results for the value of 10. Well, that's fine for this user. He's used to that performance because that's the expectations of what they're doing. But what if the first user comes and runs again? There can only be one of these in cache at a given point in time. So the user comes in and runs again, and they're not happy because unknowing to them, this scan is now in cache. They don't even know anything about it. They're just running their procedure, and it's very slow. And they report that to their help desk, and that comes out of the DBAs, and they're like, parameter sniffing strikes again. What are we going to do to solve this? Then they go through this huge gyration of trying to solve these problems, right? Okay, so what does it look like now? With SQL 2022, with DB compat of 160, the same scenario occurs here, right? User comes in, plan goes, gets evicted from cache, user comes in, scan. Okay, the first user comes back and runs again. The optimizer can look at statistics and look at this first execution and say, I think we need 2 of these now. I think the first user is better served with a seek, the second user with a scan. Everybody's happy. No one noticed any performance changes. It's all consistent and fast. And the plan that is per the needs of that parameter is put into cache. Now, we're very smart about this. We don't create a plan per user. We don't even create 2 per user. We build enough plans to match the statistics per the parameters for the actual execution. And so I really love this technology, and we're also not going to bloat your plan cache with this. So it's a very smart technology. I personally believe it's one of the best innovations we've put into the query processor in a long time. And it's a long outstanding ask from a lot of customers. When I demonstrated this and showed it back last fall, I had tears I could see in people's faces on cameras that finally we were going to go after this problem. Hey, let's see it in action. Let's see what it kind of looks like. So this is a demonstration I built with SQL Server's a private CTV build. I have a database where I've got properties and I've got sales agents per the property, which agents own given properties to sell. And so I'm showing you here, I'm running this CTV build of SQL Server, and I built a stored procedure to search for properties by agent ID. So for agent ID of 8, an index seek, just like the example before, makes sense. But if I simulate plan cache eviction here with this command, and I run a 2 for an agent ID, a scan is chosen because that's the best thing for agent 2 for the different data that results from this property search. Okay, so it may not show up as a performance problem until you run a workload. So let's look at that example. If you look at perfmon, look at processor time and batch requests per second as a way of throughput, let's go run a couple of workloads with those stored procedures in mind, like simulate a real world scenario. So let's run this first procedure example that uses a seek with like 25 users. And let's go run it and kind of see in perfmon what it looks like. And then we're going to go run the scan and see what kind of behavior might happen. A little bit similar like that diagram I actually showed you there, right? So going and running the first workload, we'll kick it off and we'll find out that it's very, very fast actually. And you'll see an interesting behavior in perfmon here. And that is the purple representing the processor time, which is high but reasonable, and a very efficient throughput in green for this workload. And in fact, if you go back and look at it, it's like 3 seconds. Hey, the world's great. Everybody's happy, no problems, right? But in simulating that diagram, I'm going to evict plan cache and then run the scan procedure now, same procedure, different parameter. And then I'm going to go back, I'm going to run the first one, just like I showed you in the diagram. And I'm going to see, does it run in 3 seconds or how does it actually behave? Well, let's go to perfmon. Uh-oh, this is a problem. Can you see how low the green is now? You can see, in fact, I draw a line here between the throughput of what it used to look like and what it looks like now. And then in the purple, can you see it's like almost at 100% CPU? That is not good. And why is that happening? It's because everybody's trying to run a scan. It's all in memory and it's very inefficient. See, it's so slow, I have to cancel this thing. So how do we solve this thing? What do we do about it? Well, if you go into SQL Server, you'll see in my demonstration here, I'm going to set this DB compat level to 160, but I'm not going to change any code. I'm just going to go back and I'm going to run the exact same workload I did before. If you don't mind, please mute yourself on the call. I really appreciate that. Thanks so much. So I'm going to run the same scenario, run the seek, run the scan, go back and run the seek again and see, do I get 3 seconds still? Does it run the same way? Well, I sure hope so. And in fact, perfmon's going to, look at that. My throughput's the same, my CPU's the same, and in fact, the actual overall workload duration is the same as well. I didn't change any code. I just ran the same stored procedure, the same workload scenario, and I did that by just changing a DB compat level. But if you don't believe me, let's go into the query store and see, did I really get 2 plans for the same stored procedure? I did. So here they are in query store showing 2 different plans, one a seek, one a scan, and we use something called a query variant to make this work. And so what appears in the query store that looks like 2 different queries is the same query. And in fact, they hash to the same query text. So great example of showing you no code changes, very common problem people deal with today based on parameter queries or stored procedures. No app changes required. SQL just figures it out. And we don't need the query store to make this one work. We're just using the query store here to show you the performance differences themselves. It's just an example of the investment we're making to make this faster for you, avoid a lot of query tuning. Okay, so the third part of the wheel of power is, well, let me stop for a second though and just check questions here. Sorry about that. Let me just double check. Let's go back up here. Let's see here. Oh, Mike Ray in the call. Wow, what an honor that is. Mike, my dear partner in the Docs team on the call. I love it. Okay, so here we go. The third part of the wheel of power is the engine, the meat and potatoes of SQL Server. And so we are always going to invest in this space. I'm just going to give you a flavor of what we're doing here. So from a security perspective, we're going to talk about something called SQL Ledger here in a second. We're going to enhance always encrypted. We've got Linux security enhancements we're doing. And we have other things in this space we're doing you'll see on the next slide. From a scalability perspective, we're going to go after and make the engine faster to scale so that you don't go provision a new bigger VM or a bigger machine and you don't see scale. We don't ever want that to happen. So we've got common scenarios we're solving in this space. And third, we want to make availability a great story built into the engine. So whether it's multi-write replication with automatic conflict detection, cross-platform snapshot backup, so you don't have to rely on volume snapshot service anymore, or even partnering with Intel to make backup compression faster, less CPU overhead for your server, and even the overall backup time faster, something called Intel Quick Assist. Intel's written a white paper already about the great gains they've seen from using their hardware technology with SQL Server. But let's talk a little bit about, here's some of the enhancements we're doing. There's just a laundry list together that all really kind of come together for a great story about our continued belief that we think the engine has to be enhanced to keep up the fact that we're industry proven. And remember, when we enhance things in the engine, if it makes sense, these engine enhancements are all part of our entire SQL story, edge to cloud. And by the way, just one quick little tip here. When you look at my resources at the end of this deck and you go to the decks I have out there, David Pless from our team has done a really deep dive on a lot of what these features look like with some great demonstrations. But let's talk about Ledger for a second as a challenge and a solution and why it's very interesting. And I'll pick on Mike Ray for a second since Mike's on the call. Mike, when you work for Microsoft, I just get to pick on people, right? So when you see the word blockchain in this challenge right here, you're like, blockchain, that's negative to me. I don't want to hear about blockchain. But if you've ever really researched blockchain, it's really all about tamper evidence and tamper resistance to data to protect data integrity. That's really what the goal of that technology is. So what customers have told us is that they want that. They want tamper evidence, track record of data in SQL Server, but I want to use SQL Server. I've got a centralized system. I don't want a decentralized blockchain. I don't trust that, but I do trust my SQL Server. So can I get the same functionality? And let's describe how we're going to provide that. Let's say that Mike is trying to track Bob. Bob's like a rogue DBA that thinks he can go in and make changes to stuff, and Mike's not going to find out that I did it. So it turns out in T-SQL, you can declare you have a table called the ledger table. It's all built into T-SQL, right? So when you do that ledger table and Bob makes a change, we have a history of changes, not just changes to the data, but we have a history of who did it. So Mike can very quickly detect on a T-SQL form way that Bob went and just made a change. Like maybe I just went into a bank transaction and gave myself a $50,000 increase in my account. Mike can go, Bob, we tracked that you did this. Not just it got changed, but when it happened and who did it. Mike can see that through something called the ledger view. Now let's say that Bob, being the rogue DBA and SQL internals guru, knows how to go into these tables and hack them so it doesn't see that Bob made the change. It just looks like Bob has $50,000 more than he used to. Turns out Mike can go in and look at what's called the ledger. The ledger is a series of internal system tables that are hidden that have hashes of the values that have been changed in the ledger tables in forms of blocks. So Mike can go in and verify the ledger and say, you know what, Bob? The ledger's off. The hashes don't line up with what changed in the system. So now all of a sudden, Mike has caught me already hacking the system tables. Now, let's say now that I is even further clever. I know how to even get access to internal system tables because I know the internals of SQL Server, and I can go fudge the hashes to line up with those tables. Now Mike doesn't know I did anything. Well, Mike comes on and says, Bob, sorry, I forgot to tell you that part of the ledger system is to take hashes of the hashes and put them in a separate trusted facility. Now, Mike can come in and verify, like a regular would, that the hashes from trusted storage, like a checksum, don't line up with the hashes in the ledger. Now we have a full tamper evidence track record, and the only way I could really fake it now is to get access to this separate trusted storage facility, which Mike has not given me access to. So we think it's exciting new technology. A lot of customers, other than just like banks, want to start using these kind of technologies. It exists today already in preview and Azure SQL database, and we're bringing this technology to SQL Server 2022. So Mike, good job. Way to track me. Just a quick fun tip is that if you happen to be going to SQL Bits, you might see Buck Woody on stage trying to track me as well. So we got a fun little demonstration we're going to show there at that event. Okay, So one of the things I mentioned was multi-write replication. I'll just briefly tell you that it's really an enhancement to what we already have today. You may be taking your database today that is partitioned across 2 servers and use peer-to-peer replication. But here's the problem and the challenge. The challenge is if there's conflicts that actually occur in this environment, peer-to-peer replication stops and you've got to resolve it yourself. And unfortunately, the only way to resolve it yourself is to let the last replica win. That's kind of weird. Like, why would just the last replica win? That's not very logical. So in SQL 2022, if you use this peer-to-peer replication technology, we will do automatic conflict detection and we'll use the last writer wins. Well, you take a timestamp of the last person who wrote based on UTC time and say, that's the automatic winner of conflict detection. So we've had several customers to say this is going to allow to let them not be blocked from writing effectively a multi-write database application across 2 different servers, all based on our SQL replication technology. Okay, so the fourth part of the wheel of power is data virtualization. Now, the challenge is the same as we've seen before. Customers want to access different storage systems, okay, other than SQL Server, but they want to use the power of T-SQL to do it, just like the promise of Polybase initially was there. And if you remember, and you've seen SQL Server, we announced Polybase way back in SQL 16, but we enhanced this technology in 19 to support various ODBC drivers for Oracle and MongoDB and Teradata and so forth. So what we've done in SQL 2022 is use the same concept to open row set an external table, so using your native T-SQL language, to access via REST APIs S3 systems. So now over here, if you use an S3 compatible system today for storage or Azure Data Lake or Azure Blob Storage, we will recognize Parquet, JSON, CSV, and Delta formatted files automatically, allowing you to query those files and just pull the results back to SQL Server. So imagine you've got a bunch of Parquet data out there from your organization sitting in an S3 storage facility. You don't want to import that into SQL Server through SSIS jobs. So now you can turn around and run queries from SQL to access that data and just get the results to come back and join them with other SQL Server tables or even other Polybase external tables, maybe based on other systems. Now, in addition to that, we recognize something very interesting in the industry over the last few years. Customers are starting to use object storage systems, other than just say Azure Blob Storage, to store lots of different data, and a lot of them do it through S3 compatibility. S3 protocol built by Amazon has become a very popular format and protocol to store all sorts of data. So what we're going to do now is we're going to expand the URL backup concept to allow you to put an S3 compatible URL inside it and back up natively and restore from other S3 sources. And you see just a flavor of some of our partners out there that support this kind of type technology. So in your head, think of, oh, we've invested in S3 as a technology, and I wouldn't mind keeping my SQL backups out there as just kind of an extra DR site. Can I use that natively with SQL backups natively and restore from there? And yes, you can. And we've had huge interest from our partners in this space. We've already done some demonstrations with them, and they've started to kind of promote that they're going to start supporting this with their technologies. So real quickly here on the on the chat, I noticed here, let's see here, one other question came up. Can SQL now see Power Pivot files in Excel? So George, any format like this that we can recognize, we can pull in. So if those files can be seen through a CSV format, then we can pull them in. I think maybe what you're asking is that, you know, how smart can we be about that? And so George, I'm not specifically knowing what you're talking about, but if we can recognize a CSV file, we can do it. Now, keep in mind, George, that in SQL 19, we had ODBC driver support, right? Including your own ODBC driver. So if there's an ODBC driver that can recognize that natively out there, then we can support it. So that's also a possibility to support the scenario you're actually talking about. And George, by the way, if I'm not getting the right answer you need, just shoot me an email to bob.ward@microsoft.com. I love talking SQL technologies, and I'll try to come up with an answer for you. So that's the fourth part of the wheel of power, data virtualization. What about this fifth part of the wheel of power? Like, what about this T-SQL thing, Bob? What are you talking about? Well, you've already seen some examples of that. You know, if you think about using all the T-SQL syntax for Ledger and accessing these other technologies, we're still enhancing T-SQL for new features. But what about some basic things that developers care about? So the challenge, of course, is that I want new features, but I don't want to learn a new language. So whether it's JSON function support, enhancing that, whether it's closing the gap for certain language areas like string processing, Windows clauses, and so forth, or even bringing time series functionalities that we do in Azure SQL Edge through T-SQL functions, we are continuing to invest in the T-SQL language itself, keep it up to date, keep it fresh, keep it modern, so that developers don't have to go use different languages to access things on the server side itself. We want to make sure developers still feel comfortable that they can use the power of server-side programming without having to do too much of the work in their actual application code itself. So these are just some examples of things we're doing in the space to enhance T-SQL. So that was a lot to cover in even less than an hour. But I think you see what's possible now with SQL 2022. Azure enabled, hybrid platform for something that's really crazy amazing. Disaster recovery, analytics, and security scenarios. Built-in query intelligence, so you get faster, consistent performance with no code changes, no add-ons required here, built into SQL Server. You see the innovations we're doing in security, scalability, and availability. We talked about SQL Ledger being a great way to track malicious actors and look for tamper evidence of things that are getting changed. You know, data virtualization being that great extension to Polybase or even backups into S3 storage. And then, of course, the fact that T-SQL language is still keep modernized and freshed out there. Now, I promised you resources, and let's just talk about some of these as we conclude today. So this is our main website. If you go to this link right here, this is where you'll find the main website for Microsoft about everything you need to know about SQL Server. We'll link everything off this thing. When we go to public preview, you'll find it there. Mike works on our docs team. When we get to public preview docs, you'll find his docs right there available as well. If you want a version of what I show you today, so you can share this with your customers or your teams, PDF version of this deck and other decks are at this site. That's a OneDrive site. I'll keep that fresh and up to date as we move along our preview release as well. If you want to sign up for early adopter program, because what you saw today sounded pretty exciting to you, you can use this link. If you want to see some more demonstrations of what we did today through video formats, you can see this from Mechanics. I did a really cool series with the Mechanics team last year. And then also I did a webinar in December. And then if you've not seen the Data Expo show on Channel 9, Anna Hoffman, who hosts that show, has had myself and other members of our team on. We're doing a current mini series with them on SQL Server 2022. In addition, what Timmy just mentioned, I know it's even hard to even think this is possible, folks, but if you're comfortable, we're ready to see you. So I'm going to SQL Bits here in less than like 2 weeks to London in person, be talking about SQL 2022. I'll be in Vegas at the SQL Server conference that you'll see in April, along with a bunch of my other teammates. We'll be presenting SQL 2022. I just announced this morning that I, in May, will be in Vegas again for Dell Technology World, talking with Dell in partnership. And to be candid with you, I'm pretty excited. I just have a laundry list of other events that are reaching out to me now that want me to travel and come talk about these technologies. So lots of opportunities coming up later in the spring and the summer, in-person events, if you're comfortable doing that, to hear from me and hear about a SQL Server. So, hey, Timothy, you know, hopefully it was power packed. Hopefully it was kind of what you're hoping for. I'm going to leave this slide up so people can still look at our resources. But hey, hey, Tracy, hopefully you can come to NYC. Boy, Tracy, man, I love NYC. So I can't wait to get back there someday, that's for sure. But let's see if we have any other questions, Timothy, as we're wrapping up.
Yeah, guys, throw in your questions at Bob. I mean, and by the way, again, we want to thank you very, very much for speaking for our meetup this morning. We really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, happy to come do this. You can tell I hate talking about this stuff, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm really excited about SQL 2022, to be honest with you, because a lot of people were asking me for the longest time, are we even going to do another version? And I'm like, I wanted to say yes. So it's really great now to get the word out we're doing it. And I'm really excited to see us march towards public preview where just about everybody can do that. Bob, do you have a list of the conferences you will be at? So I don't have like a list, Josh. If you will follow me on Twitter, which I'm not a big Twitter person, but if you'll just follow at Bob Ward MS, I do announce these things I'll be at. And right now, Bits here in a couple of weeks, MS SQL Conference, April in Vegas, Dell World in May. A bunch of others are getting lined up now that I can't announce yet, but I hope to announce soon. But yeah, so Josh, a bunch coming up, right? For Polybase enhancements, can it utilize the AWS Glue catalog for querying S3? So I'm not familiar with the AWS Glue catalog, but all I know is that we can talk to S3 systems through the S3 protocol and natively understand and access Parquet, JSON, CSV, and Delta formatted files. We know how to recognize those formats. We do have the ability, by the way, though, in this technology for you to tell us the format of a file. So I'm not sure what that technology is, but if you can tell us the format of a file, we can access it. How many SQL 22 features are already available in MI? Are asking. Right now, none of the things that I'm talking about in private preview are already there in managed instance. One of them is connecting to managed instance, but we keep in track with that team to keep this up to date. So you can rest assured, if it makes sense to be in managed instance, and in other words, it makes sense to be a platform as a service feature, it will be an MI. But yeah, we keep synchronized with that team to make sure that you don't lose something by just going to MI. That's for sure.
You know what? I sneezed with my microphone off mute, so I apologize. I realized I did that just now.
Well, Timothy, thanks again. Bob Ward at Microsoft.com. I can't be your personal support engineer, but I certainly love talking technologies. Look at these resources. Like I said, some of the things you're probably asking for, you may find them in our decks right here. But also, if you get an opportunity to come to some of these events, you'll certainly get to meet me in person, and then you'll get certainly a much deeper dive on what you're getting for these technologies.
Absolutely. Again, Bob, thank you so much for speaking for us and all this information about SQL Server 2022. It's like an exciting product. I know we're all ready to get our hands on it, but thank you so much.
Yeah, happy to be here. Look like somebody has their hand raised.
Oh, yeah. Who's that?
It's me. It's me. I have a question concerning the SQL Server certifications. Am I understanding that Microsoft gonna just kill off the standalone SQL Server certifications if they're not linked to Azure?
I wish I knew that answer directly off the top of my head. I don't. I recommend you talk to Timothy, and maybe he can track down that answer for you.
Yeah, I can track that down. Because I'm in that loop right now, getting my certification up for. We have a thing called SQL Server Insiders inside of Microsoft. I'm part of that, and so I've got to get certified for that. So I'll find out, Ilya, and I'll post it somewhere on maybe our MeetUp discussion board.
Thank you, because I noticed that so far this is not being done, and a lot of companies not ready to switch to Azure completely yet.
Yep. I know this Ilya too, by the way, from Fort Meade. How are you doing? Not Fort Meade, from Aberdeen Proving Ground.
Correct. Thank you. I'm good. Thank you. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. All right. Sorry about the meetup. So anyway, Bob, thank you very much. I'm going to turn off the recording, and hey, everybody, go have a great weekend. Bob, you have a great weekend, and thank you very much.
Goodbye, everybody. Thank you again.